Welcome. Thank you for joining us at the Being Human podcast today. I have a really special episode for today. This is the first time we're doing this, and I'm really excited about it. I've been planning on doing this for a while, and I think it's time. And that's what I want to bring someone else onto the podcast. It's not just the solo show for Dr. Greg. This is meant to be for providing resources in a lot of different kinds of ways. And one way is through conversation. So the best person for the job to bring onto the podcast is my content and community manager, also known as Dr. Greg's sanity, keeping the organization moving along here. And it is Amy Grace Miller. Amy Grace is a licensed counselor, and she also keeps the inner workings of Catholic Psych working in a lot of different ways. One thing that she does is keeps her finger on the pulse of our community, integrated life, our audience. She fields a lot of questions and reaches out and talks to a lot of people who listen. So she is a really good person to kind of stand in the gap and sort of speak with the voice of our audience. A lot of times she does that for me on the outward facing side of things where she speaks on my behalf. But in this case, she gets to speak on your behalf. And so she's going to bring some of your questions and we're going to just kind of open up some coffee talk. Without further ado, enjoy the episode. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast. All right, what are we looking at today? What are people saying? What do people want to know?
Well, I think that mental health awareness last month podcast focusing around different diagnosis and narcissism got a lot of interest, but we got a lot of just really great questions. And so, how do you know when you need therapy? Is it weird that you're recognizing yourself or your family members in all of the diagnosis that you talked about? Why is it helpful to have a diagnosis?
Yeah.
And when is it maybe not helpful?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to start because it can be really scary, especially when you have this thing that's like this professional expertise and you have to like pay a bunch of money and you have other people give you labels and judge and all this crazy stuff where it's like, what's really happening here? And is there this such a huge divide between having a diagnosis and being human? And the fact is, no, there's not a big divide. And I think what we lose track of is we are all fallen, and concupiscence, the effect of original sin, the fall, all those realities have affected our experience in this world. And we're sort of, it should be obvious. We're not in paradise yet. And there's a lot of imperfection. This is definitely not what we're made for. There's a lot of imperfection. And so what ends up happening is like we wrestle against imperfection and we want to be able to control it. We want to be able to make it go away. And in some sense, there's a really good human dimension of survival, of perfection, of growth. And it's good to want to make the imperfections go away and to try to work on ourselves and all these things. One way to have some control over this imperfection of our humanity is to have labels. We can really grasp and sort of hold mentally what's going on by like conceptualizing things with a label, with a diagnosis. It's a way to sort of wrap our mind around things and in a sense have a kind of control over it. And that's, I think, where the desire for diagnosis is, and it's also the necessity for it, because then obviously like talking between professionals, having ways to like look things up and understand treatment goals and treatment plans and do research and all these different things. It's great if we have this sort of like common ground understanding of this set of symptoms or experiences can be described with this terminology. And now we all are on the same page. The problem is we lose sight of the first fact that we're all suffering from these symptoms. On some level, in some way, in some form of combination, we are all suffering from the basic diagnosis of concupiscence. And then concupiscence can be manifest in many different ways. And some of those ways might have a diagnostic term that's found in like a psychological diagnostic manual or a medical diagnostic manual. Or it could be like a weather pattern, like a typhoon that destroys homes and kills people, and weather patterns that decimate crops. Like those are all parts of concupiscence as well. That's all part of the fall.
I thought you were saying like, the weather might affect your diagnosis.
Also true. The interaction between the environment and our humanity, like in the garden, man walked in harmony with the garden. Mm. After the fall, the garden is tanking Adam and Eve's mood. If they don't get enough food to eat, they're hangry.
Someone had a really interesting question. They were asking, how do you determine whether something is a sin or a symptom of a mental illness? So you could maybe be struggling with what you consider to be laziness or, gluttony or something. But let's say your depression, is causing you to feel this immense lack of energy. And the only thing you kind of can do in some moments is just sleep.
The very fact of the matter is you can't compare and you can't judge sin in that way. And this is exactly why it's so important to not judge sin of others. Even forget about diagnosis. Like even if you have a different internal set of experience, that might set you up for a different way of conceptualizing a behavior, where one person, it could be a sin, and another person, it could be not a sin. It could actually be a virtue.
Wow. Could you give an example of that just to help kind of clarify?
Like you mentioned gluttony. So like eating behaviors. Mm-hmm. Like somebody that's suffering with low self-image, low self-esteem, they're tempted to restrict their eating. And I'm not even talking about a diagnosis of an eating disorder. I'm just saying like a normal, healthy, balanced, within the spectrum that's not crossing a clinical threshold. We all have body image issues at some time about something. We all have insecurity. It doesn't mean we're diagnosable with a clinical threshold type of diagnosis. And we might have a temptation to say, I'm going to diet because I'm not good enough because of what I look like. And therefore, I need to restrict how much I'm eating. Mm. So for that person, eating might actually be a virtue.
Gotcha.
Because that behavior is a manifestation of that inner work that they're doing, where they're saying, I believe I love myself because I'm made in the image of God. I'm called to be a steward of my body and my personhood. And I'm called to move myself in collaboration with God's grace towards holiness. And therefore, not restricting myself from eating right now is the more virtuous thing to do. Whereas somebody else that's on a different part of their journey and they have a different set of things they're working on, at the end of the day, maybe fasting, disciplining their eating behaviors, maybe that's something that they should do for themselves because they reverence their own dignity and they're stewarding themselves in their growth towards holiness and union with God. And that's just within the realm of normal mental health. So then you throw in a diagnosis, and what ends up happening with diagnosis is freedom is significantly restricted. And freedom to make choices is one of the 3 criteria to something being a mortal sin instead of a venial sin. And this is a really important distinction that people, I don't think, really kind of go deep enough on. A lot of times people talk about this and they're like, well, they're just kind of letting them off the hook, just saying, well, it's not a mortal sin. Or on the other side of things, it's like everything's a sin. And it can be really confusing. Some basic catechesis is really helpful, but a mortal sin has to be something that's a grave action, grave material that we're talking about. There's like categories of things that are super serious in their own right. Whether you know you're doing it, whether you're free to do it, it just is itself a really bad thing. Murdering somebody is a really bad thing, whether it's accidental, whether you're free to do it or not, whatever. It's just in itself is a really bad thing.
Always.
Always. So the fact of the matter is that's one of the criteria, is if it's a bad thing, to be a mortal sin. Mortal sin has to have two other criteria. You have to know that you're doing something that's a really bad thing. And you also have to have freedom in your will to choose to not do that really bad thing. And so it's an active choice that you're making to do the really bad thing. If all three criteria are there, that's what makes a mortal sin. But the problem with the mental health stuff is when you cross a certain threshold, and we're talking about things that are diagnosable, there is a level at which the will is no longer active, making these outward behavioral choices.
It's affecting the level of freedom that someone would have.
Exactly. So we could say like severe restriction to the point of starvation is a really bad thing. We could say like a person even knows that that's a really bad thing, but then it's like they're fighting against themselves, and they're sometimes losing that battle to their own detriment, their own pain. They're suffering because they're making this choice that they think is a choice, but it's not really a choice, because actually if they could choose, they wouldn't be choosing to do that anymore. So we find in there a quality of a lessening of freedom, because there are inner experiences in which the will is really restricted. So these are all different parts to make this conversation really important. There's different elements to this. It's not like a really simple answer.
Right.
It's really important to understand these distinctions. But at the end of the day, hopefully what this points to is my original point, which is you cannot judge another person's interior life and really know what's going on. There's things that are like obviously really bad things, but we don't even know, like even the worst things, like what's really going on in that person's inner world.
Yeah, and I think that's much more challenging now in our day, because we have things like social media, and everyone is, for the most part, online, and it becomes very difficult, I think, not to look at other people. And I was thinking about comparison when you were talking about like not judging people. It's so easy to look at someone else's life from the outside and either judge or compare or think that we're less than or better than. And yet we never really know the inner workings of someone or their experience, what they've been through, what kind of wounds they have or pain they have. And then that's so important to know, especially if you are someone who struggles with beating yourself up because you think that certain things are sinful, when it could be more of a symptom, so being very well educated on, when am I free in this choice? And when is this something that maybe needs to be brought to a therapist, or, to be, that I need to get mental health help for in this area, so that I can be more free,
right,
in the area of spirituality.
It points to the spiritual life of just how much we have this illusion that we can avoid, like have this perfection of self where we're not sinning anymore. And then it's like the idea that, oh, this is a sin, oh, even if it's a symptom, you're still saying it's a sin. It's like we're sinning all over the place. This is ridiculous. Impatience, laziness, lack of charity, even just like wasting our own time, behaviors of temporary gratification. I mean, there's ways of imperfection all over the place. But the answer isn't to be like, oh, stop being so rigid and perfectionistic. It's like, actually, it's the other end of it. It's like, start receiving more of God's divine mercy. Just like realize we're all in this boat that we're like not perfected yet. And getting too worked up about that is not going to get us anywhere. But denying that fact is also not going to get us anywhere. So it's this both and. It's like, yes, these things are sin. They're not things that we're mortally responsible for. They actually bring us closer to God's mercy, because in his will, according to his plan and purpose, he reveals these things to us. And the more that we're aware of our own need for him, our own need for a savior, like we speak that, we talk that talk, And it's like a lot of words like, oh, of course I need a savior. Or it's like, well, how about the way that you're doing this right now? Like right now, you're doing this right now. Like, that's why you need a savior. Like, oh, no, that's not that big of a deal. Oh, I have this excuse or whatever. It's like, no, we actually need a savior.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's actually okay.
That's what's the hard part. I recently heard somewhere someone say, they referred to the gospel or the, biblical passage of his power is made perfect in weakness. And so like the weaker that we are, the more his power can show up. I think that that's true, like the acceptance of that weakness, the acceptance that like this is the area that needs a savior. That's just hard. It's hard being human, man.
It is hard being human. So that's what we're working on here.
But yeah, like being able to accept God's mercy in those areas is just, yeah, it's really humbling, really, really humbling.
And it's like, that's actually how much he loves us. Like, it's okay that we're getting it wrong. He's going to love on us anyway. He's going to accept us. He's going to fill us. He's going to give us mercy. He's going to bring us back into his fold, into his arms. And it's like, that's like that distinction with mortal sin. That's why it's so important. It's because like, that's the severing of the relationship with God. That's where we're actually stiff-arming God and saying like, no, I don't want you in my life. And he's like, okay, have it your way. But like everything else that's not that, it's like, we're still like cuddled up in his arms. Like, yes, we're sinning, but we're also cuddled up in his arms. It's like not a severing kind of thing. That's why people are like, why do we need to like put this weight on like what's a mortal sin? Because everything else is not. So actually it's okay to talk about like the fact that, yeah, all this stuff is sin. Like these imperfections, this concupiscence, like the manifestations of all these things that we just didn't get quite right yet. We're still works in progress. We're still working on all this stuff. The word sin should not be a feeling of judgment and being cast away and being rejected. The word sin should be a connotation of, I need my dad still. Like it's a complete reversal of what most people actually grow up with culturally, spiritually. And I think that that's where this healing is. That's why divine mercy is so important. But at the same time, I still think that a lot of people like, they're like, well, now I'm perfect because I have a divine mercy devotion. Like that's the next level thing that you're supposed to just do that novena. And then now you're perfect.
What? We're not.
Jesus is just like face palming. Good thing he knows that we're a work in progress.
Yeah. No, I think there was one part in your depression and anxiety episode when you were repeating like all will be well. If this situation happens, like all will be well. If this situation happens, if this bad thing happens, if you have to go through this, like all will still be well. And it's so reassuring because I think that we're constantly living I know I'm constantly living sort of in this fear of just like, if I do a sin, if I am imperfect, then like you're just cast out of the inner sanctum or whatever, wherever it is we want to be. I don't even know where it is we're trying to be, that we're scared we're going to get cast out of. But I think like that image of God, he's cuddling us on his lap, like, and he says all will be well. Like that really is the answer to all of the deepest fears that we have. It resonates so much with me about the worrying about the sin. Is this a sin? Is this a symptom? It's all imperfections, and it's hard not to get caught up in like the minutia of just like, I guess since I tend more towards the OCD side of things. But I think that's a fairly common problem in the church, like either being like, I don't care if anything is a sin, like I don't care about that, or being just like, did I do that right? Did I not? So yeah, I empathize with where this person is coming from. Like, is it a sin? Is it a symptom? Am I guilty? Am I not guilty? Does God still love me? Does he not love me? Like it's, again, all goes back to being really hard to be a human. So
Yeah. And that's the acceptance of it. It's like, and we have these voices inside of us, these different parts of us that are telling us that it's not safe to be imperfect.
Mhm.
And we have to earn it, and we have to believe it, and we have to like show it, and nobody can see our imperfections. Nobody can see our flaws. And we have to, and that's to your point with like social media, that we have to like have these perfect Instagram stories and these reels that show us like, even when people are like being like sort of real on social, it's still like doctored. If I choose to put something on Instagram, it's like I chose that. Like it's not like somebody's just randomly following me and taking shots whenever like I'm not in charge of that happening. Because there's plenty of times in the day where like, don't put that on my Instagram. Because we're building into that sort of like idea of like, this is what people should see or want to see. This is how I'm going to be popular. This is how I'm safe.
Mhm.
If somebody saw the real me, then I would be rejected or I wouldn't be loved, and I'm not safe. So
Yeah.
there's a reason why we have that voice, which is coming from a good place. Like it's good to want to like save ourselves and protect ourselves. But there's another dimension of it where it's like, okay, so like let's sit down and talk with that voice inside of you and say like, well, let's really look at this. Are you really not safe? And then by engaging that part, it's like now we can actually sit down and realize like, oh, this is what it means to receive God's mercy.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, we didn't really answer the question, how do you know when you need therapy? But I guess we
And we all need therapy.
we all need therapy.
It's a good question. I think it's really hard to give like a blanket answer on something like a podcast.
Yeah.
But we have like free consultations. We field calls every day of people wanting to talk through their particular situation and say like, what do you recommend here? And sometimes it's not really necessary, or sometimes people need like a good conversation, and that's not what therapy is. That's not even really what mentorship is. So whether we're talking about one or the other, sometimes it's like, I think you need to like join a church group and like find a friend, or like now the COVID is coming, we're coming out of the COVID cave. It's like, meet up with some people in your neighborhood, or like go talk to your priest. And there's a difference between like needing a little perspective and a good conversation versus like, I've been actually struggling with this for years, or this is plaguing me, this is really bad, or maybe it's shorter term but it's like really deep and really painful. And so like a good conversation is not helping anybody right now. So there's different ways to look at it, and I would say it's very individual. So there's not really a good blanket answer. Some people have more superficial issues but could really benefit from really solid mentorship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some people might have like a really deep problem, but could be helped by a good conversation with a good friend. I think it's the secular world that sort of puts mental health, professionals in this like other plane of like, we're the ninjas that can fix like the really important stuff. If it's less important, like whatever, somebody else can take care of that. But like, we are the ones. Whereas like priests who have grace, sacramental grace, through their holy orders and through confession and through the Eucharist, it's like all these things could move mountains.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sometimes that's actually really what's needed. It's really too much to be able to put into a blanket answer. But like I said, you can always, people can look us up, CatholicPsych.com, hit the contact button there, set up a phone call, do free consultations all the time, and just kind of talk through what's going on and help you figure it out.
I really do love the fact that we offer that. I love the idea of being able to call someone, because it is like you said, sometimes you've had this problem maybe, and it's just like, I don't know. I don't know if this requires a much deeper walking with someone to help me get out of this, or do I just need like you were saying, like a month of mentorship, something to just get me to the next step so that
Right.
I keep going on my own. Do I just need to like go to have a good confession or something? I haven't heard that that's common for a lot of therapists. Usually it's like you go and sit for an hour with someone, and then you don't know if you're going to get along with them, or if it is what you need, or if they're going to help refer you to what you do need, or something like that.
I mean, I think a lot of people will take the call as like setting up appointments type thing. But
Mhm.
it's for us, like we really have like a systematized way where, you can talk to any one of our therapists or mentors, and people can, specifically get a slot to have a consultation. So it is, and by the way, just as a disclaimer, that's not an emergency line. So if I always have to think about that, the legal department coming after it. But it's, if there's an emergency situation, you call 911. If you've been thinking about, is this the kind of thing that I should get some professional help for?
Yeah.
And, then we have an easy way to help you answer that, which is just reaching out.
Awesome. That's great. A lot of people were wondering about someone in my family has a mental health diagnosis. How do you navigate helping someone, without burning out yourself? Sort of where's the line between, carrying your cross and dying to yourself for someone else, or you have to love yourself before you can love others, that sort of thing. Like, where's the line between giving of yourself and also taking care of yourself?
Yeah, it's a lot of people are going through that. And I think that, if we look at the dimension of community and how God created us in his image, and he is a communion of persons, and he created us as a community of persons, it's important to not create this dichotomy between like other people's problems and my problems, because we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's problems are our problems. And likely, especially if it's family, my problems are probably their problems too. And I'm not saying that, if you have a family member with alcoholism or something like that, like, I'm not saying it's your fault. That's totally not what I'm saying. Because sometimes people's problems will manifest in a way that they want to blame you and make it your fault. And it's really not. But the fact of the matter is that we are built into these systems, and relationships are embedded with one with another. And whereas you might not be causing the alcoholism of the alcoholic, you certainly might have a role to play in whether or not you're enabling the alcoholism. And then now we're back to your problems, and it's not just the alcoholic problem. So, and then people struggle with this really hard because it looks like love.
Yeah.
It's this sort of concept of like, is this really love? And there's a conflict, and then there's back and forth, and long way around to say that if there's a situation like that where somebody in the system is struggling to a significant level, it's helpful even for the person asking the question to get some help. We work with people all the time for the sole intended purpose of managing how to walk with somebody else who has a diagnosis, a significant issue. Mm-hmm. And that is not outside the boundaries of what's appropriate. Like, that is absolutely appropriate. We're in it together.
Yeah. And when some of the podcasts you had, such as narcissism and stuff, I know that someone who struggles with narcissism or who has a narcissistic personality disorder, they may not think that they need any help. For the most part, they probably don't think they need any help.
True.
But the people who live with them or who were raised by them, you probably will want some help in.
I would say in that case with personality disorders, especially, you need help.
Yeah.
Because by definition, personality disorders have crossed a threshold where the people are very manipulative. Mm-hmm. And have learned how to expertly manipulate other people that are close to them. And if you're still one of the people that is close to the person with the personality disorder, 9 out of 10 times you're being manipulated. And if that's the case, then there's probably some dimension of your own personality, your own psyche, your own makeup that is wounded in such a way that it's allowing, at least on your end, for that manipulation to occur. And we need help. We need to be shored up against that kind of stuff. And it's not to blame the person with the disorder. I mean, personality disorders are the response to deep wounds. There's lots of wounds that lead to having a personality disorder. So it's a very sad and very broken system. In other words, it's concupiscence. It's the fact that we're all fallen and we need a savior.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for someone but what about in the situation where, like, let's say it's not a full-blown personality disorder. It's just something that, they're struggling with.
We still need a savior. We need a savior. It's still some level of the same thing. It's like we have to be able to see how we're all playing a part with each other, and then figure out at what level we need that support, whether it's like directly working on ourselves or indirectly dealing with what somebody else is working on. And again, it might not be professional help. It might be spiritual help. It might be friendship. It might be, a family member that you could reach out to. There's lots of different ways, but we all need each other and we all need a savior.
Just to clarify, you're not the savior. The therapist is
no,
not.
I said those are very specifically separate things. No, God knows I need a savior.
Yeah. Me too, for sure. Especially working with you, man. Anyway.
Yeah, well, he knows what we need. He gives us all in total of the dosage, perfectly what we need.
Well, cool. Thanks for introducing me, and then also hopefully we can come back to talk more about some of the other questions and kind of dive a little bit deeper into some topics. So.
Yes, definitely. This is great. Thanks for doing this. God bless you. Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.